Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for our first Useable Past conference. I'm Jules Corriere. I work here at the McKinney Center in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And with me is...
Hi, I'm Daryl Carter. I am a professor of history at ETSU. I want to just start out by saying thank you for being here. We're here to just listen and discuss some important issues regarding tourism in our region. And this is a collaboration between the McKinney Center, the Heritage Alliance, Langston Community Center, and ETSU Africana Studies, which is now going to be known as Black American Studies.
And I want to do a couple of announcements. Oh, did you have something else, Dr. Carter, you wanted to
No, you're fine.
So I want to take a moment to recognize some of the others who have helped put this conference together that work at the Heritage Alliance, the McKinney Center, Langston, and ETSU, and that would be Anja Fellers-Mason and Megan Toole from the Heritage Alliance, Adam Dixon from the Langston Center, Teresa Hammonds and Sky McFarland from the McKinney Center, and of course Dr. Carter from ETSU. Thanks so much for being here. This session is being recorded, so Sky, if you haven't hit record yet, go ahead and get it started. We're not going to be taking any breaks during this session, but it is being recorded. So if you have to step away for a moment, just know that you'll be able to look at anything you might have missed while you had to step away from your desk, because we will have it on a recording for you. And we are going to hear from 3 speakers. They're going to each speak, and then we're going to have a question and answer period at the end, so that you'll get to ask some questions and ask and provide some information about your own insights from the conference when we conclude with our 3 speakers.
Okay, so let me introduce our first speaker. First speaker is Alicia Phelps, who is a lifelong resident of Northeast Tennessee and is currently serving as Executive Director of the Northeast Tennessee Tourism Association. She received her undergraduate degree from Emory and Henry College, her graduate degree from King University, a tourism marketing professional certification from the Southeast Tourism Society, and is an Appalachian Regional Commission Leadership Fellow. She also serves as the Principal Instructor for the ETSU Hospitality and Tourism Certification Program. Under her steady leadership, the Northeast Tennessee Tourism Association was named the 2019 Tennessee Destination Marketing Organization of the Year. And so she's going to speak with us for roughly about 20 minutes about diversity and inclusion in tourism marketing, taking a look at how Northeast Tennessee Tourism Association has approached marketing. One of the top destinations in Tennessee is a safe and accepting community for all visitors. So Ms. Phelps, thank you for joining us this morning, and the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you all so much. Can I get a thumbs up, making sure everybody can hear me? All right, it's so good to see so many of you all with your familiar faces, and I was looking in the chat box, it looks like we've got representation from all over, so it's awesome to see folks interested in this. It's definitely something we should be interested in. So I wanted to chat with you all a little bit today about what our organization has been doing, especially last year, when it comes to making sure that Northeast Tennessee is a welcoming community for all. So for those of you that don't know, I'll give you the spiel really quickly, and then we'll get into the good stuff. The Northeast Tennessee Tourism Association, we're one of 9 regional tourism departments that are recognized with the Tennessee Department of Tourist Development. So the state is actually divided up into 9 of me. And so you can see there where we are located for those of you that are not from the area. And we're a nonprofit, 501c6, and we serve the 8 counties here, as well as portions of Southwest Virginia, Morristown, Cumberland Gap, and we even work sometimes with with Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, and Sevierville. We have been around since 1977, and we were actually the first regional entity in the state. How does this work? We have a really small operating budget. I'm the only employee. However, we hope to be hiring a part-time person very soon to help us out as we're growing at a pretty quick pace here. And we're located in the First Tennessee Development District in Johnson City, Tennessee. We have a board of trustees that range from government entities, destination marketing organizations for each of the cities we represent, as well as local businesses and whatnot. So we try to, and hotels, and we try to represent everyone on that. We are membership based. That does help us pay the bills. So we are happy to provide tourism marketing and business consultation to 75 plus members throughout our area. Coming up, I am very tired this morning. We had our deadline for our Pinnacle Awards. It's super competitive. It's been going on for 24 years. I'm tired because we had a record number of entries come in last night for this. And so I did just want to give a shout out to that. You probably see some familiar faces on this board here. I see Jules and some folks from Jonesboro as well, cameo on there. These are folks that won last year, so we do like to honor those that contribute to tourism in our area and a lot of our team players. So I did want to give a shout out about that. When it comes to COVID, this is kind of what we looked at last year pre-pandemic, and during pandemic, we often will do some question and answer series with some local business owners and things like that. And we also, for those of you that are more interested in tourism and hospitality, we partner with East Tennessee State University for a continuing education certification program. It's a 12-week course. We work with folks in a lot of different industries that deal with hospitality and tourism, as well as high school teachers, as our industry is growing and we start to see an interest at that level, and as they put that as a course requirement in at the high school level. So we also oversee this program with them, which is a neat little program. We've been working on it for 3 years now. Our organization also serves as a legislative voice, so we are very in tune on what's going on in Nashville per se, in the tourism and hospitality industry as well. So we go and visit with our legislators, and actually right before this I had a mayor in my office, so we try to stay in tune with what's going on a local level too. And we'll start to dip in a little bit to how we've kind of changed our marketing over the past few years. As you can see here, last year our big hook was I did not want to feature the norm anymore in any of our advertising. So you can see how that has changed. We do produce a magazine and a visitor guide every year, and we're happy to say that those quickly go off the shelves all over the country. So let's talk a little bit about why we're here today. I will have to say that our industry as a whole, this is something, the welcoming communities for all is something that we're super into now. It's a long road as we change kind of what it has been, and it's a much needed change. And I hope that the Northeast Tennessee Tourism Association has been a leader in that movement, especially locally. That's what we see ourselves as an influencer, and how we hopefully get others to think about how they're marketing. So after a great conversation with Mr. Dixon, who I know is on the call, he leads up a local diversity and inclusion alliance, and we started to have a deep dig into what tourism marketing looked like in the area, and I was quite embarrassed, I guess you could say, to be frank, that you know, we hadn't really had a lot of diversity in previous years as a whole in our industry. So in 2020, even though it was the year of COVID, which diverted some of our plans, it was my personal goal to make sure that that was going to change. And so we did quite a few advertisements that that had, you know, a lot of different folks, a lot of different backgrounds and cultures represented. So you can kind of see, as we worked through the Travel Safely with COVID movement, what we have done. This is just a snapshot of some of our digital campaigns, but last year we were able to reach about 18 million people with our advertising, and hopefully let them know that while it may be the best time to travel right now, hopefully in the future think about us for a visit. And you know, it went over pretty well. And for our blogs, this is where I took a deep dig into the folks that we have here locally. Anytime that we do photos of people, or obviously with the natural beauty that we have, you know, I always try to do local pictures. I always try to use local people. That is just something I'm very adamant about, because you have to tell the real story. May not be the best history, may not be the best story at times, but I will always use people that live here in our advertising and things that we do. So we took a deep dive. One of the things that I loved was the flavors of Northeast Tennessee, where we highlighted a lot of the ethnic cultures that we had in each of our towns, and it was great to highlight these folks. Some great content, YouTube videos, things like that came out of it, and we were really proud of those stories that we were able to help them tell. And then I also kind of discovered some new restaurants I didn't know about, so it was kind of fun eating my way through the area. So also what we had done last year, as you can see with some of our Discover and Adventure and Travel Safely ads, we did a lot at the Tri-Cities Airport. While it wasn't a time to travel then, this content is still there today, and we were happy to be able to promote local activities and things to do while you're here traveling safely and whatnot. And you can kind of see the transition. Down at the bottom, we've got a great lady here who typically you wouldn't see fishing. So we loved featuring her. Typically women are way underrepresented in the outdoors, and I heard a stat just the other day that females are, especially when it comes to hiking, a little over 50% are females. So why in the world are we not showing females in the outdoors? That would be crazy. So I'm happy, especially with fishing. That's kind of neat, because we have seen when you and anything that you see, when you see a picture of somebody like you doing something, oh, I can do that. So that's the message we're trying to put out there for folks. And so hopefully as we progress on with our advertising campaigns, that's something that we can portray for everyone to make sure that everybody's included. A little dig on our website. This is our main marketing tool, northeasttennessee.com. Won't spend too much time on it, but this is our main tool, and this is where you can see a lot of the blogs and things like that we post, and this is where a lot of the visitors will go to when they click on our ads or they want additional information. So after that, ironically, after that conversation with Mr. Dixon, we were able to reach a deal with the show called Air, Water, or Land on Amazon Prime. And this show featured local folks in areas that were focused on the true outdoors, so it won't necessarily be your commercial or super touristy markets, which is definitely right up our alley. And that's what we hang our hat on, is we are the true outdoors without the crowd. So we were approached by this show, and we're able to work out a partnership where we were featured on an episode of Air, Water, or Land. And this really kind of was the jumpstart of our campaigns on making sure that we were inclusive to everyone. And this also, I'll show this clip and then I'll tell you a little bit about the hardships that I have, making sure that our message is portrayed and finding the right people that want to help us tell that message. So I'll show this clip, and you can actually watch this episode now on Facebook and YouTube if you want to find out more.
How's it going, everybody? Good. All right. So I've never told a story in front of a crowd, but I figured since I'm here in the storytelling capital of the world, I'd give it a go. This will be more of a poem. This is about the place you call home. These mountains, they're hiding secrets, but everyone is privy to all the magic awaiting you in Northeast Tennessee. With hundreds of miles of trails and rivers, you might find it hard to pull yourself away from endless outdoor adventures. But the cities, towns, and counties here are brimming with Southern charm and culture distinctly their own, making them just as special as the nature that surrounds them.
Okay, so now I want to talk about a little bit about the hardships. As you can see on there, there was a little bit of diversity and inclusion, but there was also a lot of the norms that you've probably seen before. So what I found really difficult and what I always need help with is finding those niche groups of people that are interested in things that and activities and things to do that we want to let folks know that are available in the area, and that, you know, it's inclusive for everybody and it's a welcoming community. I worked a lot with some of these different groups. However, you know, I needed to make sure we were a right fit, and it was a difficult conversation. I will say that, because it was pretty awkward for me to say, hey, you know, we're wanting to change things up a bit, and we want to show maybe it's a same-sex couple, or, you know, maybe it's a person of color, or just a different culture or background in a video. And that's a really difficult conversation to have, because I don't want to offend anyone, but I have this vision and I need help with it. So that's when I discovered that leaning on specific interest groups and getting connected to them, and them sharing with us their hardships and what they want to see and what they don't want to see. And that's a great conversation to have, and it has helped us, but it's definitely still a long road that we have to go after, and to try to, you know, find these different folks and grow our community even more to be a welcoming community for people. So as we moved along on that road, I was able to touch a little bit deeper into that. And so we did a series of videos called Like a Local. And these are some of my favorites, dealing with people that had new experiences or just got to go have fun for the day. As you'll see, and you may recognize some of these folks too, so I'll play these clips very quickly.
So tell me what you guys did today. Girls, what were some of the things that we did today?
Hands-on museum. I don't remember. Do you remember?
You don't remember where we went?
Hey babe, you think we should take a spin around the track?
That doesn't sound like a good idea.
Well, you don't have to drive. Girls?
Did you guys have a good day?
It was a great day spending time with family. Lots of fun activities for the kids, and we had a good time too.
Meet Kate and Caitlin. They were in search of a different kind of girls' day out.
Now what?
First, they found their balance in Kingsport. In Johnson City, they hit the trails for views of the Appalachian Mountains.
Memorial Park Community Center to downtown to ETSU.
How did they spend the rest of their day? Find out at northeasttennessee.org.
That was one of my favorite ones, because one of the girls had never ziplined before, and she was super nervous. So we were happy to be able to share real experiences with that one. We've got a slew of those videos, including female country singers, things like that, as part of those, and they're timeless. So we'll be able to promote and share those in future years, and hopefully this year as well, a little more. So we were, you know, I talked a little bit about some of the hardships that we had, and it's something that I think tourism entities face constantly. And so I talked a little bit about it with the Southeast Tourism Society USA on their diversity and inclusion panel, just like we're talking today. And a couple things recently that we've done, we bid on an American whitewater safety video. And so we are blessed to have the Nolichucky River, which is a great rafting. And we took a long shot, and not only did we in our bid talk about the safety component, which we have some wonderful experts here, but we took another hook and said, while typically you see white males in the outdoors and on whitewater, our videos will only feature diverse individuals. And we are fully up to the task to do that. Unfortunately, we did not win that video bid, but we're going to do it again, and we're searching for other ways that we can do that as well. We typically, with things that we do now, I don't want to be the normal. So if I can find a hook with that to say, we're going to feature diversity in whitewater rafting, which is typically something you don't see, or we're going to show females, like I mentioned earlier, mountain biking. We're going to do that because I think that it's a great opportunity for us to use our reach to get out there and make a change. So I talked a little bit about our exhibits at the airport, and then one thing I'm really excited about that will have a big impact, I think, and even though to say the year 2023 seems like forever away, we were awarded, speaking of not getting the whitewater bid, we were awarded the National Appalachian Trail Conference. So that will be taking place in Northeast Tennessee in 2023, and you better believe we will be devoted to a welcoming community for all with that. So we will definitely need your help with that too. So we're really excited to put us on the map for that one. Talking a little bit about our Place for Everyone campaign. Our great intern Amanda came up with some of these shots that we'll be using, but we also did a photo shoot with part of this. Again, none of what you've seen before, so we wanted diversity and inclusion in all of these. So any photos that we'll post or ads that we run, we're going to be doing that, and we continue to do that. So just wanted to show you a few clips of those. They were really fun to do as well. A little bit about tourism, and I see some chats here. One thing that's not mentioned on this last one, I know I did see one chat question that came up. What are we doing specifically with groups and things like that? One thing that's not mentioned on this that we are working on is a remote worker campaign, and you may have heard about it, but we specifically for the locals and folks that come here, we are working to attract remote workers to the area, and there is a big focus on diversity and inclusion for that. And so we want to make sure that that our area can be known for something that is working towards diversity and further diversifying our community. And as we work to attract remote workers to our area, there'll be a big focus on the selection panel of how that works and how they'll get acclimated into the community. So we're excited to go on another adventure with that one. A little bit about tourism in Tennessee, second largest industry, big time employer. Definitely need more folks working at the moment in our industry, and probably among the hardest hit when it comes to COVID. But we feel that we are definitely one of the key components to the recovery for the economy. So two counties in Northeast Tennessee are in the top 10 major producers, and in Northeast Tennessee alone, it's a $911 million industry. That means that pre-COVID, don't want to see the numbers last year, but we'll be back. Folks spent that much money in Northeast Tennessee in a year. And you can kind of see a snapshot here of some communities and how they did. In closing, I do just want to add, yes, it's something that we're paying attention to when it comes to diversity and inclusion and marketing. I know all the cities that we work with are. While some communities are a little bit further behind than that, you know, we're not going to slide backwards on this. The train is moving. If you're not with us, you can get off. That's just how it's going to work. So it's something that I definitely need folks their help with, because like I said, it can sometimes be some awkward conversations, but our heart and our head, we're in the right place. And we hope to make sure that our area is known for being a welcoming community. And it's a long road ahead, but we're up for the task. And there's my contact information if anybody ever wants to reach out. We're always looking for folks to be involved, serve on focus groups, panels, and definitely in videos and photos. We love working with the locals. So thank you all so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from the other folks as well.
Thank you so much, Alicia. That's really informative, and thanks for the steps that you took to move past what the norm was. And it seems like a pretty perfect year to have done that when it was such a not normal year. So thanks for the steps that you took. I wanted to show you all something. Sky, could you let me share the screen?
You should be able to.
Great. I want to share with you all just a little bit, just a small little map that I worked on. We were talking about how it would be in all of our interests to work on creating the tourism that was geared toward diversity and inclusion, and also to work together to do this. And if you take a look, this is just a few of the places that are specifically designated as African American landmarks and cultural sites. And on here, there's 37 different locations in Northeast Tennessee in just 5 towns. And that's not without doing a lot of exhaustive research. And you can see, you know, that the dots are kind of approximations of where these places are, but if you see to the right, the different places that are specifically geared toward African American cultural landmarks and historical sites, you'll see that there is a lot that this region has to offer. And then if those of you who are in our area and are connected to another cultural landmark or organization or tourism destination, why adding that to a map, and if we are able to work together, we can really show where these locations are, and really put together something regionally that we could work on together. And then when we've got those locations, we can add GPS components to them so that people can look it up and go straight to those different places. But there's a lot we could do if we're able to work together. And I think that's why everybody's joining this conference right now, is looking for ways that we can work together and create a more diverse and inclusive Northeast Tennessee, or wherever you are. Now, up next is our next guest, and I'm really excited to be able to introduce Candace Forbes-Bright, PhD, Dr. Bright. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at East Tennessee State University. And Dr. Bright is a Tourism Reset Fellow and studies the social implications of representation of history on current race relations. And her presentation is going to be just representation in heritage tourism, where she says the American landscape is increasingly populated with memorial tourist sites showing a devotion to the past. Tennessee roadside historical markers, as well as other heritage tourism sites, are visible expressions of public history and serves primarily to preserve a white Protestant male history of the area. And there's a lack of just representation of non-white male history in these markers and sites in Tennessee. And I'm really excited to hear this presentation. So please welcome Dr. Bright.
Thank you, and good morning. So a quick plug for Reset. Reset it stands for Race, Ethnicity, and Social Equity in Tourism. So we're actually a multi-university and interdisciplinary research group. Many geographers, people in tourism studies. I'm a sociologist, and we study patterns of social inequity in the tourism industry. And we partner with organizations such as the African American Museum Association, and try to understand what role history plays in current conversations, basically, and how that's presented. So today I want to focus on my research in heritage tourism and how it ties into the broader importance of social justice. So a quick background, I moved here from Mississippi. And in Mississippi, I studied tourist plantations. So you might be familiar with these. There's a large cluster in Charleston, on the James River area of Virginia, and of course in New Orleans. And I studied the history they told and what people thought of this history and what they wanted out of these sites. And then I moved here and I came across what I would probably refer to as Appalachian myths, that history is not here, that it doesn't need to be highlighted because race isn't the predominant issue here, or that there just aren't sites to anchor that kind of history. You don't have to have a plantation to have that history. And I want to challenge this, and I also want to challenge the myth that inclusion in heritage tourism is for Black audiences. It's for everybody. When I've done a lot of interviews with the operators of heritage tourism sites, they seem to say, like, they make comments along the lines of, we want to get this right for the Black community. And it's not just for the Black community. This is for everybody, and this is a broader societal issue. So moving on, public history is a critical component of the ways that contemporary society, how we memorialize the past. And the American landscape is increasingly populated with these sites, and there's a growing interest in heritage tourism and what it says about our public history. So these representations we have at these sites of the past show an image of the American South that often focuses on white notions of the past. This is either overtly or covertly, and this often includes racist messages. So the controversy surrounding Civil War monuments, most of which were erected during Jim Crow, this serves as just one example of the tensions running through the American South. Historical roadside markers, which is what I'll talk about today, are another way in which public history is memorialized across the United States. The content of these signs and the intent of these signs is increasingly scrutinized by both the communities in which they are erected and the communities they represent. But despite this attention to historical roadside markers, they've been relatively under scrutinized in our region and especially in our state. So I think that their role, the historical roadside markers' role in representation as cultural and heritage tourism sites, deserves greater attention. And although these markers, they're often thought as kind of an outdated way to learn about history, a lot of emphasis is now placed on the internet, for example, or history occurs in a classroom. They do matter. If we are going to make sense of racial justice in the present, we really have to understand racial justice in the past. And in that sense, I don't focus on heritage tourism for the sake of heritage tourism. I focus on it as a way to connect the past, the present, and the future. So roadside markers, they might fade into the background. They might be just something you see out of the corner of your eye, or they might be in the back of your rearview mirror, but they subtly remind us of what we deem important as a society and what we've omitted in that. And not only that, but what we deem important in a state-sanctioned way. So in fact, my interest in the roadside markers grew from just my drive home. So I live in Jonesboro and I work at ETSU. So I drive through downtown Jonesboro and I pass the historical marker for the Emancipator, the first abolitionist papers. And then I started driving around looking for more of these. I was like, okay, that one's interesting. And the rest were not addressing similar topics. So I thought that there'd be more to this story. And then I found that there was a digital archive where you can look at every historical marker in the state online. And then I went down deep rabbit holes of looking into these. So these Southern sites of past reflection, those sites marking landscapes of public history and encouraging visitors to reflect on this history, they are fertile for critical reflection on both the past and how it's portrayed in the present. In a little bit of history, the practice of using historical markers to commemorate the past originated in England in 1863. So the first historical marker program began in the US in Virginia in 1927. And then the next state, North Carolina, followed, and Tennessee wasn't too far behind in 1950. But despite this long history, or maybe even because of this long history, we really need to reevaluate what these historical roadside markers are telling us and reevaluate them through the lens of inclusivity and socially responsible tourism. So as cultural and heritage tourism sites, these markers are dominated by sectional interests that really inherently represent those who hold power in the community. And as much of history is seen through these historical markers, it's essential that they reflect all American history, or what I call in my research just representation. That is, markers should include and represent all aspects of American culture equitably. And just representation entails more equitable representation of minority groups through these historical roadside markers as essentially tangible versions of our history and our heritage. So in that sense, historical markers, they accentuate places, people, and events that may have otherwise remained unknown to the public, but they also direct the tourist gaze to select national and local history. They tell us what's important in that community historically, or they should. So the problem there is that historical markers usually represent what is deemed important to remember by a subset of the broader community that generally is in power, right? So, and as access to power often determines who makes decisions about historical markers, it then becomes imperative from an inclusive tourism perspective to address important questions about the roles of stakeholders, their aims, and the power and politics they represent in tourism. So in my research, I assessed the extent of just representation, basically of a non-white male history in Tennessee historical markers. Let's see. And I also want to point out that when I'm talking about inclusivity, I'm not just talking then about Black history. I'm talking about Native Americans, of white women, basically of non-white Protestant males. So from a social perspective, many groups in society are not given the same consideration in heritage tourism planning. So it has to go beyond advertising to different groups, but actually representing them in the sites that you are advertising. And so before I get into findings, I want to emphasize that historical roadside markers, they really perform as interpretive framings for the values of our society. So it's one thing to advertise to different groups, but we really have to show that they're valued in the actual sites that we are trying to attract people to. So these sites, they narrate a version of history through the anchoring of these events in sites of public history. And the historical roadside markers are products of socialization that provide individuals with cues about what we value. So they construct and present a very curated historical past that continues to reinforce race relations and how we discuss race today, really. So in the American South, the dominant social representation is often one that's a romanticized South, think like mint juleps and hoop skirts, right? So we would rather have this nostalgic social representation than the harsh reality of the past of the American South. So often when we're creating roadside markers, and not just limited to roadside markers, but we're creating this idolized, simpler, distant, more peaceful time. And it's one that actually did not exist here or anywhere, right? This isn't specific to Northeast Tennessee. So getting into what I found in the historical markers, I'm coming into it with a few assumptions, right? That roadside markers are storytelling devices, that they represent a history that is deeply culturally ingrained, that this history embodies structural and historical racism, and as such, the narratives can be analyzed to assess the inequity in representation in the stories that we memorialize through heritage tourism sites. Like much of the American South, the state of Tennessee has a long and shameful history of slavery, racism, and segregation. Native Americans, Blacks, and women have been unjustly treated in our state and the South in the United States, and have lacked representation and power within the state. So Black history in the state has been problematic. Despite the abolition of slavery in 1865, we see the abuse of Blacks and other minority groups. It continued unabated for decades. Jim Crow laws protected racists actively until the mid-1960s. And it wasn't until 1965 that the first public high school in Tennessee was desegregated, and that was in the small town of Clinton. So this history does exist here, just like it exists everywhere. This segregation and racism has also impacted the way history was recorded in Tennessee, as the efforts and contribution of Blacks and other minorities to the history of our region and our state has been downsized at the advantage of the contributions of white males, who at the time had and still have power in lawmaking and society shaping in our state and region. So that means the history of these groups within the state is not given equitable visibility in how we tell our history and how we memorialize our history. And we see that American history is bound by accounts and contributions of multiple people with different backgrounds, is rich in diversity and reflective of our current society. Still, our commemorative landscape and what we provide in heritage tourism, it really excludes various dimensions of this American history and American people, and it focuses predominantly on a specific group, and that would be white males. And that's not just my observation, that's what the data will show us. So historically, African Americans have used more traditional, often oral methods to conserve memory. They did not have the opportunity to share their memory with larger audiences in the same way that whites did. And this is because their commemorative practices were contained within their own community. And so they had limited access to these public places that are now being memorialized. So from heritage sites to schools, minorities have historically been deculturalized, in that their cultures and history are not given the same representation, and they're often erased or minimalized. And in my data, I see that that has not changed much even in recent years. There's some things they're doing right, maybe around Memphis, but we've made very limited progress in our region. So prior to my study of historical markers, there's only been 2 that focused on them in Tennessee. The first, since the inception of the program in 1950, of course. So the first one was Jones, 1988, and he did a statewide study where he analyzed what the focus of these markers were and who was erecting them. And the second was more limited to one county, and that was Abdullah, 2015. So Jaron Abdullah explored historical production just in Maury County, Tennessee, and in an attempt to gain insight into Maury County's history and how it's portrayed, Abdullah examined just the 27 in that county. And of these, they found that 22 were dedicated to the history of white residents, and 5 mentioned African Americans, but out of the 5, only 2 were looking at or recognizing the contributions of African Americans, and only 1 focused on slavery. So these historical markers are erected in places highly visited by the African American community, but still probably not doing the work of just representation. And then in the only published statewide study of Tennessee historical roadside markers before the work I did with Andrew Joyner, Kelly Foster, and Ocean Tanny at East TSU, Jones analyzed 1,170 roadside markers across the state. And again, that's late 80s, so 88. And in his analysis, he found that markers devoted to Black history or famous white women accounted for only 0.7% and 0.8% respectively of all markers. So to give that context, at the time of his study, there were more roadside markers solely dedicated to David Crockett than to either of these groups. Additionally, Native American markers accounted for only 3%, while famous white men accounted for almost 12%, including 3% that's dedicated to the KKK founder Nathan Bedford Forrest. So this particularly visible expression of public history really serves a white Protestant male history of our state. Roadside markers then exclude African American views and experiences from the overall narrative, and African Americans and other minorities are often omitted from these commemorative sites. This lack of representation not only threatens public memory, but it's also historically inaccurate, and accuracy is latently important when we are trying to celebrate the past and what it means for the present. So the exclusion of people of color from representation of the past may also impact their access to power in the present. And these issues speak to the relationship between power and the production of history through tourism, where the exclusion of minorities from representation of the past has negatively impacted this access currently. And the exclusion is important for a number of reasons. For example, presentations of the past shape the public's perception and knowledge of culture and heritage, and wider current social discourses around race as well as gender. So the ability to erect these markers is often held by the bodies of individuals that do not reflect this population. More specifically in the US, state government as well as local organizations and individuals can fund and therefore influence what historical markers are erected. The content of these memorializations is indicative of the cultural value or political importance of a limited group's perception of the past that, as I've emphasized, does not reflect the larger population. So if the values held by those responsible for deciding what is worthy of remembrance reflect the common heritage or a more selective and limited past, markers and listings are examples of what discerningly could be termed client or constituency history. And then we end up where we are today. So looking at the profile of such groups illustrates an overwhelming majority of white males, especially in the South. So when we're looking to clarify groups that are erecting these historical markers, so they can be erected by public lawmakers, but also by private groups and then sanctioned. So the ability to fund and make decisions about historical markers then gives white males control over memory and helps sustain their power over American history, enabling this distortion to continue. So the distortion of historical facts and omission of contributions made by racial minorities and white women. So in Jones's study, he was positive, he was optimistic at the end of his study. And he said that, and I quote, "Most recently in 1987, as a result of a newly conscious and organized constituency, Ida B. Wells, a late 19th century civil rights activist and newspaper editor in Memphis, was memorialized with a marker. It is tempting to say that this represents the beginning of an increase in marker enlisting behavior from the Black or Black female constituency, but it's too early to tell." So in my study, I wanted to assess that. Have we made progress since 1988? The answer is no. In a nutshell, the answer is no. So in my study, I assessed the accuracy of this statement and critically reflected on its meaning using the 313 markers that we have erected since 1988 across the state, right? So not limited to this region. And these markers are all available on hmdb.org if you want to look at them yourself. And I found that we haven't made much progress. I used the same coding scheme that Jones used in '88, and I put the numbers side by side, and that's why I say he was optimistic instead of accurate. So understanding, like all states in the South, that we have an extensive racial history riddled with white privilege and white supremacy, that this is still reflected in current relations and processes of social representation. So our finding is that little has changed, and this is not very surprising to me. So while we began this research with the purpose of assessing the sites across Tennessee and evaluating Jones's prediction, we found that little progress has been made in promoting a more equitable or just representation through historical roadside markers in the last 3 decades, and that we've really failed to reach just representation as a state, and even more so as a region, because we did even look at this by the 3 grand divisions, and East Tennessee is lacking behind the other 2. So while we were unable to capture really societal values in our research, our thematic analysis is pretty revealing of perceptions of what and whose history that we are demonstrating is important in Tennessee. And these results indicate that even though today and in 2019, when I did this research, that there are still more historical markers dedicated to Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, founder of the KKK, than all white women and Native Americans combined. And while we see an increase in markers dedicated to Black history, if we only account for those directly related, and that means moving those identified as ancillary, those that mentioned a Black person, but it wasn't about them, then we only have 5 more African American markers across the whole state than those that are still dedicated to Forrest. So really our past events in Tennessee remain to be framed from a white Protestant perspective, and little progress has been made over the past 3 decades. And this history constructs meaning for social context in the past and present, and gives us a reality that is socially constructed and narrated through these markers. And so in conclusion, memoryscapes are reproduced and they construct history. But as I've found, and as I mentioned, I don't think would be that surprising, this is not really a representative history, nor is it socially just. So we need more community inclusion in the planning of historical tourism to take steps in the right direction. And so I think that's the only way to get past this mythical version of history that is curated to be the popular version of history that's not accurate. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. We have one other speaker today that we are privileged to have, and I want to take just a quick moment to introduce him. He is William Ison, and he's an East Tennessee native and the director of Black in Appalachia. He coordinates the project's research, community database development, documentary film and photography production, oral history collection, and educational events with residents. William will be presenting Black culture infrastructure in Northeast Tennessee. William, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Daryl. Let's see. I'm going to share. Okay, so here we go. All right, so like Daryl said, I'm from East Tennessee. My family's been here for a while. But the Black in Appalachia project, this is kind of the mission statement, just to kind of let you guys know that we're working to highlight the history of African Americans and the development of the Mountain South and its culture. And it's a community service. This work that we do is for Appalachian residents with families' roots in and through the region. And none of the things that we do, I think similarly to some of the successful tourism and historic preservation efforts that we see in the region, it has to be done across sectors, and it can't be, nobody can do this work by themselves. And so particularly with this project, we work with residents, which also includes small organizations, small historical preservation organizations and churches and archives, public media, which I work with East Tennessee Public Television, East Tennessee PBS in Knoxville. They pay my health care. And universities often, School of Information Science departments, history students, grad students. And so we work closely with universities because they have a lot of the know-how that we don't. And I hope you don't get too mad at me, but we're going to take a little medicine before we boogie down the road a little bit. Particularly whenever I was approached with this, me and Adam talked for a long time, as we normally do, about this conference. And the more I started thinking about it, I started putting stuff together, and I really was like, well, what are we asking people to be invited into when we talk about inclusive regional development? And I think having a real, Ms. Phelps talked about some of those difficult conversations. Just really quickly, we'll get right into it and talk about some things right quick, because when Black folks from and around Northeast Tennessee talk about Northeast Tennessee, I think that oftentimes the things that people talk about in their homes are not the things that get talked about in these meetings. And so, it's apparent that ETSU, with the current kind of racist policies of the president and some of the administration, really has an issue with their athletes and racial justice that needs to be addressed. So if we're talking about inclusion, we have to be able to recognize and understand and speak loudly about kind of the racist infrastructure that exists in Northeast Tennessee right now, not just historically. And the racist incidents that have occurred at ETSU have continued. There's one every year at least. And so I think that that's something that we have to think about and figure out how to address when we talk about inclusivity, right? That also said, there's another glaring kind of omission. Was in Erwin, Tennessee in 1918, the entire Black population was ethnically cleansed out of Unicoi County. And that has not been addressed by anybody in any significant way. To know that there was a lynching and the entire Black population was driven out of a county, I think is very important to talk about, particularly with the opportunities for outdoor recreation and whitewater rafting and all these other things in Unicoi County. So I think that we have to look at these things. If we're talking about inclusivity, there's a reason people don't necessarily want to drive to certain counties and certain areas to spend their money, right? And so I think we have to move forward and look clearly at some of these things. Similarly, and it was mentioned earlier talking about some of the colonial and colonial sites and early settlement sites in Northeast Tennessee and even Southwest Virginia, that the story of the people that actually made these sites functional, the enslaved people, is not mentioned. And if it is mentioned, it's kind of in passing, where in reality, the labor of these people, much in the same way the labor of athletes makes a university, the labor of these enslaved people at these historic sites made it possible for these men to sit around and talk about the establishment of the state of Tennessee. This is Rocky Mount, and apparently, I guess his name was William Cobb. His son owned my great-great-granddad and my great-grandma. So that history for me and for other people of color, I think when you go to these sites, I think people of color understand when they see in passing that there were some enslaved people. I think people of color generally know, well, we built this place and made it possible for the state of Tennessee to exist or even be thought of, right? So I think that those are important things to talk about, but I'm not going to berate you the whole time. We're going to get into some of these inclusive regional development ideas. And the thing that also struck my mind in thinking about this was, what are the opportunities to shift some resources and power in regards to tourism or heritage tourism in Northeast Tennessee. And a good place to start in my mind was during COVID and during the pandemic, you really couldn't do anything. And so one of the things we started doing as Black in Appalachia, just to keep ourselves from going crazy, we would plan road trips from Knoxville to Elizabethton, and we would go down Highway 11E, and we would stop at the Black historic sites or where historic Black neighborhoods were. And we did it also for Highway 11W, riding from, Knoxville to Bristol down Highway 11W. And it became really apparent once we started doing that is that there's really no shortage of Black historic sites, as you saw from the map that was shared earlier. And that didn't include all of them. That was just one concentrated area. And so there's there's an author, Philip J. Obermiller, who wrote African-American Miners and Migrants about the Eastern Kentucky Social Club in Harlan County, Kentucky. He wrote this thing once that it was a book review, but at the end he said, you know, Black invisibility in Appalachia is a vincible ignorance, meaning that it's something that can be easily overcome. And in doing this work, we've been doing this work for about 8 years. Well, no, close to 10 years now. And everywhere that we go and step foot, there's literally no shortage of Black history or Black narratives in almost every nook and cranny of our region. And so the idea that Black invisibility is a thing, I think, is quite frankly bullshit. Like, I don't think that there's such a thing as Black invisibility in Appalachia. I think that it's the devaluing of that history and not including it in the broader narrative. But so we started doing these road trips, and I'm going to take y'all on a little. I tried to keep this as short as possible because some people, like Sky knows, I could just talk forever and ever. But we'll just go down the road a little bit here. One of the things I want to kind of highlight for folks that you may or may not know, in talking about Black cultural and social infrastructure, you oftentimes find these kind of formations of the church, the school, and the cemetery. And so this is a screenshot of an old USGS map of Russellville, Tennessee, which is in Hamilton County. But you can see the two crosses and the flag. So that's the church, the school, and the cemetery. And oftentimes in Black communities, from emancipation to desegregation, you had these three things oftentimes would exist, if not right with each other, in close proximity to each other. And so that the Black community during the Jim Crow era would have everything that it needed to take care of their young people, their old people, and their souls, right? So that's something to keep in mind as we're going forward. And we utilized kind of that template for identifying more rural Black communities as we went on our COVID road trips to go see sites and talk with people. But one of the things I want to highlight with this is places where I see opportunities and places that need resources that I think can help build out the Black tourism in Northeast Tennessee. Just for maybe there's somebody here that has some money or has access to money and maybe they can make it happen. We're going to start in Thornhill, Tennessee, which is in Granger County. And so this is the class of Thornhill Primary School or Thornhill Colored School from the 1940s. And the building is still there, just north of Clinch Mountain, off of Highway 25E, and it's own private property. And it's still there, and it would be great if somebody fixed it. One of the things that is really hard to find, I think, in general in Appalachia, but more so with Black communities, is the one-room schoolhouse. Being able to locate and find our one-room schoolhouses is a very arduous task. There were a handful, probably 5 one-room Black schoolhouses in Carter County, Tennessee in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And those school records didn't even exist at the state level. So when we went to go look for the Black schools in Carter County, Tennessee, those records never made it up to the white schools. One-room schoolhouses made it to the state records, but we were unable to find. So basically what we've been doing for the past couple of years is trying to track down these one-room schoolhouses that don't exist anymore in Carter County, Tennessee. But it's just because that these things weren't valued. There's also this one in the Strahl community in Hawkins County, Tennessee, It was Saunders Chapel School. And similarly, you can see it's in somebody's yard. It's adjoining a school in Hawkins County. And here's what the school used to look like. Look at those kids, looking cute. And so the building is still there. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about like these cultural clusters, but I think that the one-room schoolhouses in general are a huge are a huge component of Black cultural infrastructure that I think are probably more endangered than anything right now, from my perspective. So yeah, let's go talk about these historical clusters, and these aren't the only ones. I've just happened to identify Rogersville and Greenville. Newport is another one of those, also is Morristown, where you have these clusters of kind of really vast Black cultural infrastructure. Rogersville in particular, they did a really good job. This is Price Public Community Center and Swift Museum. It was an old African-American school, primary school, but it also contains the Swift Museum, which memorializes the late historically Black college and university that existed in Rogersville at one time. But they did a really good job. That's what the building used to look like. They tore that building down the year after desegregation. So there's probably some shame associated with it, and they want to, I guess, pretend like it didn't exist. But that building's gone, but the bulk of the rest of the buildings are being utilized by the Hawkins County school system. Adjoining that, there's the Swift Memorial Park. There's the Swift Museum and Price Public School, which I showed earlier. There's also a cluster of churches in that community. There's cemeteries. This is St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, was one of the historically Black churches integral in the development of Swift College as a HBCU. The city and a kind of a cross-sector grouping of people have taken it upon themselves to really renovate this, and so they've redid the stained glass windows, the roof, and so like I said before, like none of this stuff can be done like just one group, and so they've kind of combined forces in Rogersville to preserve a lot of this stuff, this Black cultural infrastructure, and also utilized kind of as a placeholder these historical markers. So oftentimes with these sites you'd see, particularly in Rogersville, there will be a historical marker is the first step to the preservation of the actual space in a lot of times, which I think is kind of a really smart way to preserve and hold on to these spaces. What else? Oops. So Greenville, yeah. So Greenville is similarly one of those places that has kind of this intact cluster of Black cultural infrastructure spaces. This is the Negro Women Civic Club. This was like refurbished by residents and community partners in Greenville. And it serves as kind of like a community center and a place where people can have meetings. It's not a very big space, but people, you can cook food and there's tables in there to sit around and have a meeting. But just kind of give you an idea about, this is just also a very quick snapshot of like the kind of the cultural infrastructure in Greenville. There's one of the oldest cemeteries in Greene County is there. There is strong speculation that enslaved people are buried there. There's also so many churches you can't throw a rock without hitting a church, and these are all historically Black churches that have been in the community for a very long time. And they kind of all center around what used to be the George Clem School, which is the historically Black school in Greenville, Tennessee, and that is still standing. But so this area is kind of like the cultural hub, Black cultural hub of Greenville. And, you know, it's evidenced also by the 8th of August every year, which is our region's Emancipation Celebration Day. You know, they close off Davis Street and have, you know, block party, and the 8th of August celebrations occur at the J.J. Jones Community Park. And so it's also green space is utilized really well by the community. Here's us trying to meet during COVID. We're properly spread out. This is Lions Chapel AME Zion Church in New Canton, Tennessee. And so it's another community, historically Black community in Hawkins County that has kind of that configuration of the church, the school, and the cemetery. The church and the cemetery are in great shape, but the school, and I took these photographs off of the Douglas Alumni Blogspot website, but the building is still there, the school building is still there, and the community members want to turn it into a community center, similarly in the same way that we've seen other things happen, like with the Langston Center or McKinney Center, or even the Price Public Community Center. The walls are still there. They're brick and concrete walls. There's just no roof on the structure. So the shell looks intact, but there's just nothing there. And I think providing support and resources for the people in the community would be really good use of capital and preservation and reuse of Black space. Kingsport, I saw in the map that there was, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the original Douglas School in Kingsport, which is a Rosenwald school. Julius Rosenwald was the CEO of Sears and Roebuck, and he spent a lot of his money building over 5,000 Black schools across the South. And this was one of them. And so Douglas School now has been reused. It's Teddy Roosevelt Elementary School in Kingsport. And so that has been a really good reuse of space, but I just wanted to show this because I think it looks like a really cool building, and it's still there. Also in Kingsport is the V.O. Dobbins Center, which kind of used the footprint of the Douglas School, the newer Douglas School that was rebuilt in the Riverview community. But after desegregation, the building kind of fell into disuse. And so they used components of the original school building, the Black high school, in the creation of this V.O. Dobbins Community Center. It's got a senior center, it's got like a rec center. And so, but it's utilizing that same footprint, and throughout the building, it'd be hard for you to utilize this space and not know that it sits in the footprint of a historically Black school. They did a really good job with that. So I think that that's one of the things that I count as like a really good use of historic space in modern times. But I do want to show you guys something. Like on that map, it talked about that map that you shared earlier. It had like the Hassan Shrine Temple in Kingsport. And I'm really glad that you kind of showed that. Okay, so this is the Riverview community, which is, you know, where Black folks were allowed to buy houses in Kingsport. So that square's the V.O. Dobbins Center. But this area up here, what once upon a time was kind of the Black business district for Riverview. And so we often talk about the school, the church, and the cemetery, but we also, there's also the storefront. And there's also the lodges, the Shriners Lodges, the Freemason Lodges, and Hassan Shrine Temple is in this kind of strip. That strip, which could provide a really great economic service to this historically Black community, there's no businesses in there. There's the Hassan Temple is still there. It's kind of in disrepair. So economic, an infusion of capital for this business district could really be a real boon for the community, because you've got people in and out of the community all the time. And I think that, and people still live there. And so when we talk about this cultural infrastructure, I think the storefront is also one of those things that we have to consider. What historical Black storefronts are left? Because like as we've seen in Bristol or Knoxville, oftentimes the Black business districts get urban removed. And so we don't have very many of those left, but I think that there's a good opportunity here to save and reuse some of those Black business spaces in Riverview. Also, who am I? I don't live in Riverview, so I'll talk to people in Riverview and see what they think about it. So also some really positive reuse of Black cultural space. This is the Slater Community Center in Bristol, Tennessee. We've had events there. It's a great modern space. Similarly to some of the other spaces, they've reused them. And I think one of the things was really striking to me is when they reopened the Langston Center, it's called a multicultural space, multicultural arts. It's not called a Black cultural space. And I think moving forward, the idea of the retooling of these spaces, multicultural spaces, I think is really important and valuable in the way that because these are not Black spaces anymore. After desegregation, these places fell into disuse. The Black community didn't necessarily use them anymore. But similarly to the Langston Center, you can't walk into the Langston Center and not know that that was a Black school, right? You can walk into Rocky Mount and not know that there were enslaved people that provided the labor to make the state of Tennessee be created, right? So I think context is really important. I think interpretation is really important by people with humanities backgrounds and people that can take that historical narrative and interpret it for the general public is really important. But to say that the Black history is not there is not true. You just have to do the hard work. Like Ms. Phelps was talking about, like this is going to be really hard work, and oftentimes it's going to be really ugly when you're talking about also lynching or racial expulsions or racial violence that occurred in our communities. So say that to say we've got some glowing examples. That's the McKinney Center. I love the McKinney Center. Also a Black school in Jonesboro that's been reused as an art space. And there's the Langston Center again. This is when it was being constructed. I will say one other thing about Johnson City. I didn't talk about Johnson City, y'all, because I don't feel like I can talk with any great authority about the Black history in Johnson City. There's other people on this call that can. But there's an AME Zion church close by to the Langston Center. I think that there's an opportunity to similarly create kind of these Black cultural clusters of preservation and reuse in Johnson City, because I see them. I see like the first Black church. I see like the AME Zion church down the street from Langston. And I think that providing resources for these spaces is probably the primary need that I see. There's others that can talk better about that than I can. And here's a website, blackinAppalachia.org. There's my email address. Feel free to shoot me an email about anything. We're also on all the things, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. And I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah.
Well, thank you, William. And Jules and I would just like to talk for just a quick minute about some ground rules as we go forward. And so one is that since we have, a limited time, we'd ask each participant to be able to ask at least one question. We want to make sure that people are they're asking questions, not giving speeches. Okay. If we need to move along to the next question, please do not be offended. We don't want to offend anybody. We're just time constrained, and we want to be fair to all. Jules, do you want to cover some of the others there?
Sure. We've also got a moderator on chat, so that moderator is going to keep an eye on important chat commentary and insert it into the conversation as appropriate. And we just want you to remember we're each human, so if you've got questions, be respectful in the way that you frame those questions. And we'd love to open the floor up now to you all to ask questions or provide insight. So let's see if you've got, throw up a hand icon or let's see, who do we have? Anybody with any questions?
Can I ask a question?
Please, Teresa.
Okay, so this is something that we are facing with a nonprofit that I serve on the board for. And Alicia, when you were presenting and you showed the picture of your board, it is all white. what steps are you taking to try to diversify your board?
You're on mute, Alicia.
I can take a stab at that, I guess. You know, in our area in particular, on our board, we look for folks that are general managers or in leadership roles with those organizations. So it is hard to diversify the board sometimes. So I was actually part of an Appalachian Leadership Fellowship Institute, and as folks were, and this is a good example, if folks were accepted, you know, you don't know their backgrounds per se, and it turned out a lot of the class was predominantly white, and so there was a lot of feedback about that, and I know they were paying attention to the next cohorts that they did, so that's definitely something that we struggle with too.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a question. I know a lot of the environment that we're in today, none of us here built it or constructed it, but we do have to deal with it. I have a big push initiative of Black philanthropy throughout the Ohio. I'm up in Ohio. I know a lot of the decisions and guidance come from the nonprofit and philanthropic sector and the funding. So do you see there's necessity to have a Black philanthropic initiative where we create our own funds, foundations, and raise funds to address these type issues and work and collaborate together? The reason why I ask that is because one of the main core problems that we have is that Black people have never been seen as human in America, starting with the Constitution. We're seen as less than human beings. So that lack of humanity that we don't do in our system due to historical things, our philanthropy comes through the churches, of course, historically, but you could be bombed, beaten, or even murdered for showing philanthropic endeavors and investing funding. So we had to do it covertly and quietly. So today I see a real big push that if we can get engaged philanthropically and get that support of those philanthropic dollars and create our own, that it'll really help our progress as we move forward. I appreciate everybody's effort.
Do any of our panelists have an answer for that?
I do. That's something that I did look at in my research, is not just what these sites are portraying, but who is behind them and what that means. So when we looked at kind of the main funders, it was a bunch of groups, and then we tried to look at pictures of them, and most of them, it was white males. But the one place that I would say is probably doing it right is Shelby County, outside of, or Memphis, or outside of Memphis, I'm not quite sure. But that's
It's Memphis.
Memphis, okay. That's the place where we saw the most improvement in representation. And we looked at those funders, they were local groups. It wasn't the local government, it wasn't the state government, it was local groups, it was Black churches, it was civic organizations, and they kind of took ownership of their sites and went through the process of erecting these memorial markers at their site. So I do absolutely think that that's a big part of it, but I also think that we can't leave it up, just say, you know, that's their job to do it. I think as a community, everybody has to support that and be involved in it. But I do see the places where improvement has been made. It was the Black community that took ownership of it and moved that forward.
Thank you, Dr. Bright.
Yeah, I want to kind of chime in. I do, like, oftentimes the Black church is the last thing that's left. And sometimes especially when the Black community, there's so much out migration in Black communities. But I will say that another thing to consider that I have seen is oftentimes where there's Black political representation, not always, but oftentimes where there is Black political representation, you see communities more willing to dedicate their resources to do the work. I think of, like, Benham and Lynch, Mr. Massey, Benny Massey in Lynch, Kentucky. It's the city councilman, and they've been able to do some preservation efforts around the Black coal camp there in Harlan County. Then you also got, like, Ron and Jill Carson in Pennington Gap, Virginia, with the Appalachian African American Cultural Center. Jill is on the county commission, or is it the city council? And so it's oftentimes where you see Black political representation that people tend to do the right things. And the same thing with Jonesboro, I think, would also say.
We had something come up in the chat bar about how local governments are often roadblocks towards inclusivity. And I was wondering from Alicia, are there communities that are impacted financially because as a tourism director or promoter, you don't want to promote certain areas where people don't feel safe? And does that affect their bottom line? And could that be a way that changes could be made?
100% accurate. There are certainly areas here in Northeast Tennessee that are not as welcoming as others. And you can see that in the economic impact numbers. And, it flows across the board in other industries too, but that's certainly an incentive. And we typically see these areas, they're not focused on tourism the way others would be, but they're also necessarily, places where I wouldn't send anybody. Because if again, like I had said earlier, if you are not welcoming to all, you're not going to be on my radar. So we're just not putting up with that. But 100%, that's an incentive for them to get their act together, I would definitely say.
Two things. One, we have a link here in the chat for feedback, and so as we're talking here, if you'll please make use of that, we would really appreciate that. The second thing, I want to take my moderator hat off just for a second to say this issue of not being welcoming and public officials. We just saw that very real issue on the campus of ETSU, where we had public officials making very troubling statements about our university and about our men's basketball team. And by the way, we have a $500 million local imprint every single year here. And while you didn't hear the N-word, you could certainly feel the undertones of it. And so that is equally damaging when you have people in positions of power and authority who are making statements, and we make the mistake of saying, well, nobody said the N-word, nobody did that, so it's not racial. Well, yeah, it is racial. You don't have to say that to convey that out there. So it's incumbent upon everyone to make sure that behavior is not tolerated, that the public doesn't tolerate that kind of behavior going forward, because it does have an impact on tourism.
Can I ask more specifically, related to that, Daryl, is East Tennessee doing anything to address the sundown towns that have existed historically? Like, I know when William had mentioned Eastern Kentucky, there was a community in Eastern Kentucky that was addressing that history. Is that happening in Northeast Tennessee?
I'm not aware of it, but I'm also not a public historian either. And so there's a wonderful gentleman on the meeting here, Dr. Lee, that I work with in the Department of History. He may have more insight into that than I do. I'm not aware of it. And my sense is that regionally, in recent years, it has been reluctantly, we're going to move in this direction. We're going to do that. And you can see where people are doing that. I mean, Irwin, I think, had that issue too, where they wanted more tourism, in part because 26 cuts through the county. And so they're reluctantly not going to be as mean to Black people. I'm being deliberately provocative. But you see what I'm saying there. So, yeah, there's some issues there. I can't give you a more definitive answer. I'm sorry.
I'm afraid I can't either. There have been some minor efforts to address the issue, but broadly, I don't have an answer for you.
William, that might be a project for you.
I don't need any more projects. We're just going to help Ms. Phelps figure it out over there. I will say that, I mean, in regards to Irwin, you know, through kind of public education, they embraced the elephant that got lynched there, right? And so like the elephant was embraced, and they put little elephants all around downtown. And so, yeah, I don't know what, I'm just going to push mute.
Other questions, comments?
Yeah, William, I noticed that they were more willing to talk about the actual elephant in the room than the real elephant that was in the room. They embraced the elephant, but they didn't really talk about that whole mentality. And there was a podcast that was done by students 2 years ago that won a national award, and the students looked into and did a historical podcast on that event. It was, I listened to it on NPR, so if anybody's interested, you can probably go and find it on their files. And so the students explored that, but I haven't seen any stirrings of looking beyond that.
We have a raised hand from Heather Osborne.
Oh, Heather, yes, let's hear your question.
Hi, yes, I was wondering, I guess this is towards Dr. Bright. What type of things were you thinking of putting in, like, for the placards around town? What type of wording, I suppose, that kind of thing? Like my fear would be that people would go there as like a, you know, how people go to see, you know, I don't know. I would be afraid that the way that it was worded might attract the kind of people that you may not want, like, you know, people that go to see serial killers because, you know, I guess it doesn't make any sense to people. Like, I'm trying to figure out how to word.
Yeah, like there would be a backlash against it.
Well, it's not really a backlash, but that people would, depending on how it was worded, like how respectfully done is that what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that that's where you also involve the Black community, you involve descendants. But there is some controversy around it, and it is considered dark tourism when you're talking about slavery, just like you would memorialize the Holocaust. You know, it's not something that would attract you for like in the same way that I mentioned the mint juleps and hoop skirts, right? It's not that romanticized version. But they do have problems. Like in Mississippi, the Emmett Till marker has been continuously vandalized. But as far as like how to be sensitive with the wording, I think that that's where inclusivity also comes in the planning of it and in how to word it. But what we found is that most of the signs that you could even code as African American or Black history, we're still not doing it right. Like it was still taking kind of a backstage. So I think that there needs to be signs that bring it front and center, right? And I think going through William's presentation, every one of those is like, I wish there was a sign there. I wish there was a sign there, you know? There's so much opportunity, and it doesn't have to be like the large plantations that other states have. There's still that history, and there's still a way to word it respectfully.
One other idea comes to mind as well, and that not all of the historical markers are connected to trauma. We had amazing Black business owners here, and that history is erased too. And that's part of American history as well. To know where these Black businesses were, to know where these Black homes were, to know about the first Black person in Jonesboro who ran for office in the 1880s. I mean, that's also a part of the American historical landscape that has been, you know, not valued and not paid attention to. So I think those markers, in addition, also need to be present. We had another question as well. How do cultural institutions and individuals make positive change that will help encourage policymakers and those influential in tourism make change? I think that's a really brilliant question. And this could go to anybody right now. I think if you're doing something inside of your cultural institution, what are you doing to affect change in your own community?
I think a quick comment on that one is it's much easier to elect better policymakers than encourage current policymakers to make a change. So I think it starts with being involved with voting and or running for office. But I think that if you're thinking about current policymakers that don't see this from the same angle, that's a much different battle.
In my experience, policymakers are not the brightest humans on the planet. And so oftentimes you do the work, you know, community members and different like collaborations between cross sectors do the work, and then you just kind of lead them by the nose and they'll show up and to get their picture taken, right? So, and I think if policymakers cannot see the opportunity for, you know, that photo op, then I think that then they'll totally be on board and be more willing to give those resources.
Oh, we've got a great question in the chat from Karen Childress. It's a marketing question, but I think it could also be like a community or an institutional question as well. Are there activities that would attract more diverse groups, activities that we're not thinking of or promoting, or does making the history more inclusive coming from, sorry, are there activities that we're not thinking of or promoting? And does making the history more inclusive and more welcoming truly draw people here? That may be an Alicia question, or maybe.
Yeah, that's great, Karen. It's good to hear from you. I would love to know more about activities that maybe we're not thinking of. That's definitely where we lean on folks like you all and focus groups on ways that we can make our area be more inclusive and activities that we're not necessarily looking at the moment. And then we do see feedback from individuals, especially in some of our marketing campaigns online, where you can easily track things like that. That showing, you know, photos and videos and things like that. It does help and it does work, but then at the end of the day, when they get here as a visitor, we have to make sure that our locals are talking the talk that we portray us as doing. We have to make sure that it's all a true story. So like when we go back to those communities we mentioned a few minutes ago that aren't so welcoming, that's why we wouldn't recommend them. But that's a great question, and you know, if anybody has any suggestions for us, I would love to hear them. I think you should have my email from the end of my presentation. Please do so.
I think that also speaks to what Dr. Bright was talking about earlier is, if they come, okay, so you've marketed a town or an area and people come to it, but then they don't see themselves. They don't see themselves anywhere. They don't see themselves in the landmark markers, the historical markers, or in any of the interpretive places. So it almost seems incumbent upon tourism to really talk to town leadership and policymakers and the people with the money to make sure that those places are illuminated for their own bottom line.
Yeah, and I think following up on that, even if you take travelers of color out of the equation, which you can't, I think that that's an important part, is that people of all races are increasingly demanding a truer and more authentic narrative. And we've seen this, we've been studying this over about 10 years. So we've seen there's an increasing desire to have the real version of history. And especially as the younger travelers are becoming the ones spending money, there's this change, so that Black history is not just for Black people, and that the storytelling is an important part. So I think that, sometimes there's this audience of saying, like, this is how we make profit, and then there's a different audience saying that this is what it would take to make it socially just, but I don't think that they're mutually exclusive at all. So the chasing of profit does not in any way disallow it from being socially just. I think that the way to bring more people and to improve that profit is to focus on inclusivity for all markets, not just travelers of color.
Right, because Black history is American history.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if Heather has another question or her hand is just still up. Okay.
Other questions?
Can I throw out a piece of data right quick, since seems like we're wrapping up? But one of the things that stuck with me, this is back in 2013. Dr. Karita Brown gave a presentation about the changing demographics in the Appalachian region. She talked about how the Tri-Cities was one of the only regions in areas in Appalachia that saw an increase in Black population. Most areas in the region saw a decrease in Black population over the span of years. And so, from the 40s on. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that it's not that there's a lack of people in the region, particularly in Northeast Tennessee.
As we begin to wrap up, thank you, William. I didn't know that. I didn't know that piece of information, that we were the only place that the Tri-Cities was the only place that was increasing in population that way. As we begin to wrap up, it would be great if each of you would maybe in the chat bar pop in one idea that you heard that stood out for you today. Just kind of like pop them in there. Let's see some of the things that might have stood out for you. And as you're thinking about that, we want you to think about maybe a call to action. Conferences have a half-life that's very, very short. And to make, to move this into your own work, I'd love for you all to take a moment right now to maybe write down, think about one thing that you might immediately want to do, a minimum elegant next step to incorporate what you've taken away from today into the work that you're going to be doing. Okay, so if you've written that down or thought about it, I'd love for us, Dr. Carter and I wanted to really hear, just kind of popcorn out, what are some of the things that your minimum elegant next steps that you might take inside of your own work or your own organization?
There's one in the chat, Jules.
Going to visit all the historical markers in Jonesboro. Continue writing letters to the editor. More presentations. Making our museums more inclusive in the history we tell, way past overdue. And I think your team is doing a really great job of that here in Jonesboro. Oh, that's a great one, Sammy Keys. Never realized community organizations could be part of the installation of historical markers. I'll bring this up to the community groups I'm part of.
The one I think you skipped over, Jules, was Ken said, keep the network thriving by connecting all of us together and bridging many of us to more and more resources, which I think we all, in creating this today, had the vision of making sure that we know about each other. So that's a very relevant idea.
Yes, I'm sorry, I did not see that one. Things were scrolling past. That's brilliant. Continue to reach out and making working friends across sectors. And if you all want to be connected with each other, I invite you to put your contact information inside of here. And Sky, can we provide a list of attendees?
If I would have to get permission to make, contact information available. So we'll look into that.
So for now, not knowing if we can do that, if you do want to be part of this network, I encourage you to go ahead, because this is being recorded and you'll have access to it. If you put your contact information into the chat bar, we'll be able to be connected to each other.
And I will I will send out the recording and resources at a later date.
And Dr. Carter, do you want to remind everybody about the May conference coming up?
Yes, our next one is coming up on May the 27th. And so you will see some more things coming out about that soon. We hope to have you there. Secondly, there will be an issue of the links will come out, things of that nature. You'll see it on social media. Also, we want to continue these conversations. We want to thank the Heritage Alliance and the McKinney Center and the Langston Center, as well as ETSU, Black American Studies, Department of History, etc., for being a part of this, and ways that we can work together going forward. So for me and my side of this, thank you, and I appreciate it. And Jules, do you have anything else?
Our intention is to continue having a series of these conferences and reaching out to different organizations to have these conversations. If you've got some ideas and some subject ideas, topics that you'd like us to explore in the future, why we'd like to hear from you, you can write to us at our email, or you can put it in the chat bar, because this is for all of us. And just as we heard from our panelists earlier, we need to hear from the outside and what others want in order to be able to provide programming that you're going to come to. So please let us know what you'd like to hear more of.